No dilly-dying, welcome to Local Profiling episode 27. British Railways number 71,000, Duke of Gloucester. It's about time that I talk about this engine, and after having talked about the turbo motive in the previous episode, it's the only logical follow-up. So let's get on with it. So regardless if you prefer to call LMS 6202 the turbo motive or Princess Anne, we do remember that locomotive was cut up for scrap following the Harrow and Wealdstone rail crash of 1952. For British Railways, this meant a gap that had opened up in their fleet of express passenger locomotives, mostly 462 Pacifics, which met the old LMS classification of 8P. Fortunately, BR had a clever guy working for them designing new steam locomotives at the time. Robert Arthur Riddles, sometimes nicknamed Robin Riddles, had created the standard range, comprising 12 brand new steam locomotive classes, which were made by combining the best practices from all of the big four companies. Or at least 3 of them, because the GWR seemed to be left out of this. The first of these engines were the standard Class 7 Pacifics, better known as Britannias because prototype locomotive 70,000 was named Britannia. But these Pacifics would serve as the template for something special, as the final class introduced for the range was the standard Class 8 Pacifics. But the word class seems misplaced, because there would only be one locomotive built to this design, emerging from Crewe in May of 1954. Number 71,000, better remembered by its name, Duke of Gloucester. It was also a bit of a stretch to call this locomotive a standard, as it was the most unique locomotive in the whole range, even if she was mostly based on the Britannias, right down to the tractive effort related geometry including 250 psi of boiler pressure and 74-inch driving wheels. But whereas every other BR standard steam engine had 2 cylinders, the Duke had 3, measuring in at 18 by 28 inches, allowing the engine to develop a tractive effort of 39,077 pounds. Which is definitely powerful enough to reach the 8P classification she was made for. By contrast, the Britannias had bigger 20 by 28 inch cylinders. But because they only had 2 of them, they had a tractive effort of 32,162 pounds. But the 3-cylinder arrangement on 71,000 was more like a necessary evil, as Riddles initially wanted to make the Duke a 2-cylinder engine like all the other standards, but for that to work, the cylinders would have to be so big that the locomotive became too big for the British loading gauge. Which has nothing to do with the weight, but rather it's the height and width locomotives have to be built to in order to cope with existing infrastructure, like bridges, tunnels, and doorways in various buildings like roundhouses and maintenance shops.
Do you understand?
Sir, yes, sir!
You may have also noticed the rather unique valve gear setup. Duke of Gloucester was built with Caprotti valve gear, which was invented in the early 1920s by Italian architect and engineer Arturo Caprotti, and had a rotary camshaft on the outside. Compared to Walshart's and Stevenson valve gear, which are both piston-driven, Caprotti valve gear is said to have less grunt at low speeds, but it can increase the mileage of the locomotive between maintenance intervals by 25%. However, in service, Duke of Gloucester was a massive disappointment, which had to do with its construction. This was because of a 50-50 case of bad luck between some areas of the technical drawings being wrong and the workers at Crewe deviating from other areas of the drawings which were actually right at the time. For example, the firebox had an ash bin and dampeners which weren't proportioned correctly. And then there was the GWR double chimney which wasn't cut out for the exhaust of the cylinders. Because of these issues, as well as other oversights on the design and construction, the Duke would burn a lot more coal than it probably should have, and engineers, or rather engine drivers, struggled to maintain a full head of steam on it. It was so bad the locomotive was demoted to pulling lighter boat trains along the North Wales coastline, which was such a light job to the point that it wouldn't need a Class 8 locomotive. Hell, some firemen intentionally called in sick at times, just so that they wouldn't have to work on the engine. Riddles wasn't even allowed to modify the locomotive to try and improve it, because by that point, BR executives decided to leave it as it was, especially with the modernization plan having kicked in, with new diesel and electric traction steadily taking over from the steam locomotives. This led to the Duke being retired in December of 1962, and initially only one of its cylinders would be preserved at the Science Museum in London, with the rest of the locomotive sold off for scrap. Fortunately, it arrived at the famous Wooden Brothers scrapyard in Barry, languishing there until 1973, when a dedicated preservation society called the Duke of Gloucester Steam Locomotive Trust managed to buy the locomotive, along with the tender, smoke deflectors and double chimney of a 9F. Fast forward to November 1986, and 71,000 was recommissioned by the Duke of Gloucester himself, with the locomotive returning to steam after undergoing an extensive overhaul on the Great Central Railway. This even included fixing the various issues that plagued the engine in service, and thanks to these fixes, the locomotive rumbled back to life with a vengeance, finally capable of showing what it could truly do, even going toe-to-toe with the big Pacifics from the Big Four era, like the LNER A-Force and LMS Princess Coronations. And those were locomotives that the Duke couldn't hope to match in service. In fact, the Duke even outperformed two of these locomotives, 4498 Sir Nigel Gresley and 6229 Duchess of Hamilton, during the Shep trials held between September 30th and October 3rd of 1995 on the West Coast Main Line. As its preservation career continued, the Duke managed to achieve impeccable reliability, though there was one little hiccup on June 9th of 2007, when the engine operated a rail tour from Preston to Carlisle via Settle, where, for operational reasons, the locomotive's start position was changed to Carnforth. Then, just over 30 miles into the journey, the locomotive was stopped at Penrith with leaking tubes in the firebox, and removed from the train. It was withdrawn for repairs and returned to service in January of 2008. But again, despite this small hiccup, the Duke remained in service for mainline rail tours until 2012, when its boiler certificate expired. But a few weeks ago, either at the end of October or early November of 2025, the engine returned to steam from another big overhaul. And who knows, maybe the Trust can continue to put the engine through its paces, and even further modify it to test the theoretical capabilities of an entire batch of standard Class 8 Pacifics. If only history had played out a bit differently, eh? Also, is it just me or does the Duke occasionally have different number plates on the front? Sometimes with brass numbers, sometimes with white numbers.